Hello, I'm Sophia Besch, and this is The World Unpacked. Today on the show, we're talking about how developments in AI and attempts to regulate them affect geopolitical strategy. In the news last week, we saw the release of an impressive new Chinese AI model by the company DeepSeek, which has triggered major falls in the US stock markets. We also saw a couple weeks ago the unveiling of a new rule from the now former Biden administration, the ambitious Framework for Artificial Intelligence Diffusion, which could reshape how US advanced AI technologies are shared around the world. So, why does this matter? The US is trying to put export controls on AI chips, which are the powerhouses behind next-gen tech. By controlling who gets them, the US can set the global AI agenda. That's the idea. Washington wants to strengthen ties with friendly nations, but is also attempting to limit the ability of others to catch up. What then are the implications of the new Chinese DeepSeek for the US export control regime and its attempts to control computing power worldwide? Should these news change anything about the US's approach? And what do we think is the Trump administration going to decide to do with Biden's rules? Luckily, today on the show, I'm joined by my colleague Sam Winter-Levy, who is a fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program here at Carnegie. He's going to help us understand the US's approach to AI, how we got here, and what to expect. Sam, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Sam, let's start with a bit of context setting. Okay, so a few months ago, you wrote about an emerging age of AI diplomacy. What did you mean by that?
Yes, I think what we're seeing right now is the development of these potentially extremely capable AI systems, which I can talk about in a little bit to give you some more kind of context on how the industry sees it. But as we see these kind of increasingly powerful AI systems emerge, governments around the world are becoming increasingly aware that those systems could be central to their economic plans moving forward, but also their national security agendas, their national security priorities. And so governments around the world are trying to position themselves in this kind of emerging marketplace, in this emerging industry. And to do so, they need access to the kind of fundamental inputs that feed into those systems. So things like AI chips, AI models, the kind of algorithms, the intellectual property that's coming out of labs in Silicon Valley, but also in China. And so when people talk about this kind of emerging age of AI diplomacy, what they're talking about there is the kind of jockeying between states and the kind of trading between states to try and get access to these kind of really advanced systems that could have kind of major strategic implications in international politics, but that rely on these supply chains where there are kind of choke points at various points, many of which are controlled by countries like the United States and its allies. And so this emerging age of AI diplomacy, we're going to see states kind of trading, bargaining with the United States, bargaining potentially down the road with China as well, over access to these kind of key AI inputs. And so then this question emerges of what should those bargains look like? What should those deals look like? What should the United States be trading in exchange for these AI systems?
Okay, well, that makes sense. I mean, I saw that we're talking here really about AI experts, right? And you've written about the AI expert dilemma, where you explore the concept of what it means to have AI leverage, right? Using AI as a bargaining tool. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I think it might make sense to just take one step back quickly and just to talk about the underlying technologies here, because the picture there has changed even in the last kind of 2 months or so. So in December, OpenAI released the results of their latest model, which is the O3 model series. And this is a kind of new paradigm of model. It's a new type of model. So at the end of last year, there was a lot of talk about AI systems potentially hitting a wall, potentially plateauing, and that this kind of the previous paradigm that a lot of AI labs were using was perhaps running out of steam. And then in December, OpenAI released the results of this new model, and on one kind of particularly important benchmark called the ARC test, the ARC benchmark, developed by this researcher called Francois Chollet, who's been this kind of very serious AI researcher, but also quite skeptical of the kind of potential of some of these systems. This new OpenAI model just smashed this benchmark. Previous models had scored around kind of between 0 and 5% on that over the last kind of 5 years. There'd been very little progress. OpenAI's model scored 85%. And so this, for a lot of researchers at these labs, this seemed to hold out the promise that we're now in this kind of new paradigm over the last couple of months. We can kind of see, they talk about seeing the runway ahead to reaching artificial general intelligence, which is where you have systems that are as flexible, as adaptable as humans, but with all the kind of all the benefits of scaling that you get with artificial intelligence systems. And so that promise for folks at the AI labs there's a lot of excitement that we're kind of a couple of years away from really just the emergence of transformative technologies. So just to give one sense of the kind of narratives that are going around about this, there was this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal by Dario Amodei and Matt Pottinger. Dario Amodei is the CEO of Anthropic, one of the major AI labs. Matt Pottinger was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration. And they talk about the emergence of these highly capable AI systems in the next 1 to 2 years that would be like having a country of geniuses in a data center that could potentially, unlock incredible cyber capabilities, new weapons design, biological weapons capabilities. And so that's the kind of key context to understand when we think about every other kind of question related to AI diplomacy, leverage, bargaining, the geopolitics of AI is this kind of key kind of technological context where a lot of people in the field think that we're 1 year, 2 years away from really significant breakthroughs.
And all these people and these breakthroughs have all happened in the US.
That is a great question. So the frontier breakthroughs are all taking place in the US. At the same time, a bunch of Chinese labs, most famously DeepSeek, are releasing very impressive models that are generally kind of replicating some of the results coming out of the frontier AI labs, but just a kind of couple of months behind, and often at lower cost because Chinese labs are kind of still constrained by a lot of the US export controls the US government has been applying to kind of limit China's access to chips. So the Chinese have had to come up with kind of new, more efficient ways of training these algorithms to kind of work around these export controls. So the picture here is kind of a little bit complicated. The US is certainly leading when it comes to the kind of development of frontier AI models. China is kind of a fast follower. But for a lot of the kind of key inputs to these models, in particular AI chips, there the US lead seems a little bit more robust, maybe a kind of couple of years lead. But there's a lot of uncertainty around all these kind of forecasts.
And that's where, getting back to this idea of the export dilemma, that's where the AI leverage lies right now, and where the bargaining chips are in the hand of the US, at least for a couple more years, is on the input, the chips side of this equation.
Yeah, that's right. So I think, when I talk about the AI export dilemma, what I'm trying to get at there is that for countries like the United States, there are some kind of conflicting policy imperatives that policymakers are trying to balance as a result of their advantage in these AI systems. So on the one hand, the US really wants to export its AI systems all over the world. It really wants to help US tech companies build data centers in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America. It wants the whole world using AI systems because that's a big source of kind of commercial profits for US companies, but also of influence in promoting kind of US values and government standards. But on the other hand, the US government is quite worried that if we really are 1 or 2 years away from transformative strategic technologies emerging, they really want to have control of that. And they really want to have control of the kind of underlying data centers where these systems will reside. And so when I speak about the AI export dilemma, what I'm trying to get at is this kind of tension between balancing exporting US technologies worldwide, which US companies really want, some US policymakers really want, but also retaining control of the underlying intellectual property, the secrets, the actual data centers where you need to train these models within the United States and its close allies.
Okay, well, that makes sense. And I mean, in your writing then, I think you go into sort of 3 different visions for how to approach this dilemma, right, between control and exporting. Maybe we'll start out with where the now former Biden administration landed. Tell us about sort of different approaches to this dilemma, what we've seen from the Biden administration, and then we'll get into where the Trump administration might fall.
Sure. So as I see the debate here, there are basically 3 broad approaches to this dilemma.
Yeah.
And we can come back to talk about how the Biden administration tried to navigate this. But the first approach is what I've described as a kind of strategy of control. And for folks in this camp, many of whom are kind of national security national security professionals, a lot of China hawks, this view is most famously articulated by a former researcher at OpenAI called Leopold Aschenbrenner. And for people in this kind of strategy of control camp, they are extremely worried about near-term breakthroughs in these highly capable systems that could transform international politics over very short time horizons. And they think the kind of risks of allowing those sorts of breakthroughs to happen overseas, or the risks of those breakthroughs taking place maybe on US systems, but in data centers that are built in the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia or somewhere overseas,
Sure.
that creates too many risks of intellectual property theft, of those data centers potentially being seized by a state whose interests don't necessarily align with the United States. And so it's better to kind of lock everything down within the United States, maybe within some close allies like the Five Eyes intelligence partnership with the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but definitely lean on the side of keeping everything...
Caution.
Yeah, caution, keeping everything within the United States. So that's the kind of first camp, the strategy of control. The second camp that I describe is called, I've called it kind of a strategy of diffusion. Diffusion is not a great word in this context because the AI's diffusion rule, the Biden administration's diffusion rule that they released.
You came first.
I came first, so yeah, we'll go with that. But the second camp that I'm calling a strategy of diffusion is more common among the US tech companies, in particular companies like NVIDIA, Oracle, a lot of the kind of chip giants, and a lot of US business interests as well. And in their view, the bigger risk is not that US model weights, which are the kind of underlying parameters that emerge from training a model, like the underlying kind of intellectual property secret. The bigger risk is not that those get stolen because they're built in they're hosted in a data center overseas. It's not that the UAE seizes control of a data center. The bigger risk is that the US locks everything down within the United States, and then it just cedes the kind of global marketplace to Chinese tech companies, to others. Right. And that ultimately the US just loses market share, it loses influence, it loses revenue. And remember, a lot of these innovations are coming out of private sector companies, and they need the revenue to generate further R&D capabilities. And so a lot of people in this camp look back at the experience that the United States had with 5G over the past decade, where China really just outcompeted the US when it came to building out 5G networks in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, just all in many parts of the world. And they view that as a kind of a real lesson in how to lose US technological influence. And that the downside of the strategy of control, that because you're maybe scared about some speculative risks, in their view, speculative risks about new kind of weapon systems being designed by these kind of super powerful systems, you become too cautious, you don't allow US tech companies to sell their products overseas, and you just end up ceding the ground to China.
Okay, and then the third camp.
The third camp, which I've kind of called a strategy of leverage, sort of tries to take a middle ground between these two. So it tries to balance promoting US exports overseas, but it also seeks to apply a lot of strings and conditions to those exports, and to make those strings and conditions a kind of the focus of pretty coercive negotiations between the United States and countries that might be seeking to acquire those technologies. And so it's kind of strategy of leverage because you're trying to leverage the United States' advantage in this industry right now in exchange for concessions. And those concessions could either be related to, for some people, they could be related to AI governance standards, AI security standards. So, the US will share its technology with you, but as long as you have good cybersecurity protections in your data centers, as long as you kind of promise to use the technology responsibly. But that leverage could also be used for a much broader set of US foreign policy priorities. So maybe the US will trade access to chips in exchange for concessions, in exchange for military cooperation on a particular issue. Maybe in exchange for, one example that people talk about here is the Gulf states, maybe in exchange for them distancing themselves from China, not just in AI, but more broadly, entering a kind of US sphere of influence. That could be a kind of condition for getting access to US technology. Maybe in exchange for normalizing ties with Israel, you give the Saudis additional supplies of chips. So the point
using it as one tool in the general foreign policy.
Exactly. So just viewing chips as like something you can bargain over, not leaving it up to the free market to just, companies to make commercial considerations, but bringing it into the arsenal of kind of US diplomacy and trading over it. And so that's kind of the third camp that I've laid out here, this kind of strategy of leverage.
Okay, that's very clear. And now that we have sort of the three camps as they exist in the analyst's mind, let's talk about the politics and where the US administration has, which path they have pursued. And for someone who hasn't followed this as closely as you have, who might have just seen the headlines and who might have followed over the last year, many of the tech entrepreneurs, the leaders in this field, change sides politically. Many of these tech entrepreneurs arguing that the reason they are moving into the Trump camp is because they feel like the Biden administration has been too harsh on the business interests and too harsh on innovation and been going too far in its regulation, and they expect better, they expect more from the Trump administration. Tell us your assessment of where the Biden administration landed in these three camps.
Yeah, so the Biden administration spent kind of a couple of years basically debating these questions and playing around with them. And the original impetus for this emerged out of negotiations that the Biden administration was conducting with the UAE. So the UAE, just for context here, is super rich country, and they have big ambitions when it comes to AI. It's clearly a priority of the leadership at the highest levels. They see that they have this kind of opportunity to kind of inject themselves into the AI race, and the reason they see that opportunity is because some of the key things you need to train and deploy AI systems at the moment are access to energy and access to capital and also access to land, the ability to kind of build data centers quickly. And the UAE has all of those things. They have a lot of energy, they have a lot of capital, and they can move fast. They can build nuclear reactors fast, they can build data centers quickly. They don't need to rely on the kind of, they don't need to deal with the kind of NIMBY politics that you might have in the United States.
Energy to power the data centers.
Exactly. Energy, these are really kind of energy intensive. These are, the energy demand is kind of remarkable. We've seen US tech companies trying to kind of turn on nuclear power stations in the US. That's a hard ask, and if the UAE is just going to offer you, a bunch of reactors ready to go, that becomes much more appealing. And so the UAE really wants access, and the UAE has been approaching US tech companies over the past couple of years and offering, trying to get access, offering to build data centers for them. And this raised a lot of exactly the issues we were talking about in this export dilemma. The US government wants to do this, but also it doesn't entirely trust the UAE because the UAE has close ties with the United States, but it also has close ties with China. And so the US government is very kind of wary of just giving the blessing, giving the green light to these tech exports. And so for about a year, the US government negotiated with the UAE over what sorts of conditions it should attach to exports of the particular impetus for this was a partnership between Microsoft and G42, which is the UAE's biggest tech company, which is chaired by the Emirati National Security Advisor. And ultimately, over the course of this year, the Biden administration basically agreed to allow this partnership to go forward in exchange for G42 distancing itself from Chinese technology companies. So they had to divest from Huawei, they had to rip out Huawei hardware, they had to make a show. There's some debate about the extent to which this really happened, but they had to basically move into a US. They couldn't have one foot in both camps when it comes to advanced AI systems. They had to kind of pick the US. And so this was viewed as a kind of success by the Biden administration. And in the last kind of month of its time in office, it basically tried to generalize this approach to the whole world in this kind of, in these circles, kind of famous AI diffusion rule, which is an interim final rule released in the kind of last week of the administration, but which the administration has been working on for a long time. Broadly, what this rule does is take this deal that the US worked out with the UAE and apply it to the entire world. It divides the world into different tiers. Some of those tiers, the top tier of countries, which are close US allies, get unrestricted access to US chips. The third tier is US adversaries, competitors like China, Russia, they remain unchanged. But for all these countries in the middle tier, this rule basically lays out a set of pretty restrictive conditions that those countries have to agree to if they're going to get access to US chips, basically. So it's really, I would view this as kind of ending up in a sort of strategy of leverage in my framing, that they are agreeing to exports. They are trying to diffuse the benefits of US technology worldwide. They are trying to kind of, they're trying to kind of find a compromise between these various camps. They are trying to help US tech companies build overseas. I can talk more about the specifics of how they're doing that if necessary, but they're also applying a lot of strings to these deals to try and kind of coerce, persuade, lure countries into an American kind of technological orbit.
Okay, I think that's pretty clear in terms of the three tiers of this rule. What has been the response from industry when the Biden administration published this rule?
So parts of industry absolutely detest this rule. So in particular, companies like NVIDIA and Oracle, both big US tech companies, have been vociferous in their opposition to it. Oracle, I think, called it something like the worst piece of technology policy to ever come out of the US government. They think it should be renamed the rule for the advancement of Huawei, the framework for the advancement of Huawei, Tencent, and SMIC, big Chinese tech companies.
Right.
NVIDIA have lobbied aggressively against it. both these companies view this, it cuts into their market share, probably. It limits where they can build data centers. There's some debate over the actual effect it has on their revenue and on their kind of ability to operate. But it certainly, at the margin, forces them, a lot of these companies wanted to build big data centers in places like Malaysia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. And a lot of those projects you now will need, it may not go ahead at all. You need permission from the US government for them to go ahead. The US government was very worried about those data centers being used to smuggle chips to China. And so it's a real crackdown by the US government on these companies' ability to operate in a lot of markets where they could previously operate in a pretty unrestricted manner. So it's kind of unsurprising that companies like NVIDIA and Oracle have complained aggressively about, have complained really intensely about the rule.
So it's called the diffusion rule, but it limits diffusion
exactly.
the way that these companies would like to pursue it.
Exactly. And the rule is quite carefully designed to try to allow a lot of chip purchases to go ahead. So in some respects, it kind of, on small scale orders, it streamlines the process. There are a lot of orders that you previously needed a license from the US government from before that it now gets rid of. And it is designed to try and allow US tech companies in particular, they have a much easier time. Like if Microsoft or Amazon or Google want to build data centers in a lot of the world, the way the rule is designed makes it much easier for them to do so. So actually, a lot of the companies like Amazon and Microsoft have not been. I wouldn't necessarily say they've supported it, but they've certainly not been as public in their opposition to it. Brad Smith, very senior leader at Microsoft, came out saying that he expects that Microsoft will be able to comply with the various kind of cybersecurity and physical security conditions in the rules. So in some ways, the rule just strengthens the position of US cloud computing companies because it makes it much easier for other countries to get access to chips if they partner with US tech giants. So in general, industry has been opposed to it, but there is some nuance there.
Yeah. And in terms of responses from allies or countries that might fall not under the tier 1 but instead under the tier 3 of this new rule, I mean, what's your sense? How closely has the rest of the world followed the negotiations here? Do they understand what it means for them? What have been responses?
So the rest of the world is not happy about this, I would say. So for countries in the tier 3 group, that was countries like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, nothing really changes for them. They couldn't get access to these chips before. They still can't now. The countries that it really matters for is the countries in tier 2.
Tier 2. For
some of those countries, the way the rule is designed, it only kicks in if you are trying to buy pretty large quantities of the most advanced AI chips. So for a lot of countries in the world, that is just not really, they don't have ambitions in that area. It's not really a major issue for them. But for a lot of countries, this is a big issue. And in particular, the way the tiers have been designed, tier 1 is only 18 countries. The US has a lot more than 18 allies and partners. Right. So a lot of US allies don't find themselves in the top tier. And I think that was a big shock to them. I'm sure they were kind of briefed upon this beforehand, but at least in their public reaction, they've expressed a lot of surprise and disappointment about this.
What are examples of that?
Yeah, so some key examples would be countries like Poland, countries like Israel, countries like Singapore. These are Turkey, a lot of countries like this, NATO states, EU member states. The EU is divided.
The EU has been divided, so it's not applied to all of the EU. Okay.
So most of Western Europe is in. Tier 1 is basically Five Eyes intelligence partners, some Western European allies, France, Germany, and then some key members of the semiconductor supply chain, so Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. But it's not a lot of Eastern Europe. It's not the Baltics. It's not Poland.
Interesting.
A lot of kind of very close NATO allies that the US is kind of relying on for cooperation on a bunch of other foreign policy issues. India is not in tier 1. India is in tier 2. So for a lot of these countries, this is a real kind of unilateral flexing of US muscle, imposing restrictions on potentially the key industry of the future for, in their view, kind of unclear reasons. The reason the tier 1 is so small is that for the Biden administration, it's not enough to just be a close US ally. You also have to be a close US ally with a history of kind of cooperation on sensitive national security technologies, and also the demonstrated ability to crack down on smuggling or remote access to chips that takes place within your borders by countries like Russia or China. So Singapore there's a lot of reporting on Singapore being used as a way for kind of Chinese tech companies to kind of get backdoor access to US technologies. Israel has smuggling issues to Russia. Poland, I think that was part of the concern there. Turkey, also major reporting on smuggling through Turkey to Russia. And so one of the goals of this rule from the Biden administration was to really try and enforce these export controls that it's applied on China by cracking down on these smuggling networks that have sprung up. And so that's why a lot of pretty close US partners are not in the top tier, and they are very unhappy about that.
Interesting. So it's uncomfortable, but it's transparent and coherent in the way that these tiers are applied, would you say?
Exactly, yeah. So I think that's one of the goals of the administration here was to present a framework, to give business clarity, to give other governments clarity and be like, this is how many chips you're going to get. If you do these particular things, if you can sign a memorandum of understanding with the US government to unlock more chips. And that includes things like distancing yourself from Chinese tech companies, applying more cybersecurity provisions, cracking down on smuggling within your borders. So this rule does now give businesses a framework, and foreign governments as well, a kind of framework for how to operate. It does not give foreign governments any means of moving between tiers. So you can unlock more chips within each tier category, but there is no way in this rule, as it's written at the moment, for India, say, to move from tier 2 to tier 1. So it's a very transparent, blunt, and explicit use of US power to try to set the terms of the market in AI chips.
Okay, I think this might be a good moment to take a little break. We've sort of recapped how we got here, what has been the Biden approach, and why does this matter? And then after the break, I really want to talk to you, Sam, about where you think this is going under the Trump administration and what it means for US power in the AI space. Coming up next after this short break.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. Okay, we're back. And I want to pick up on something you said earlier when you were talking about how the UAE quite demonstratively had to sever ties with China and choose a camp. How realistic is it to make countries choose their camp on AI? Let's start with that question, maybe. Do you think this actually works?
So that is a great question. So in the case of the UAE, the US applied a lot of pressure on the UAE to kind of move closer to the US technological orbit, and at least in the domain of advanced technologies, AI technologies, to cut ties with China. So to rip out, for instance, Huawei hardware, not from the entire country, but from any data center that was also, hosting Microsoft intellectual property, for instance. There is a lot of debate over the extent to which the UAE really has cut ties with China in this way. I think it's clear that they have made some moves towards the US. They really did distance themselves from Huawei. They really are trying to they really do see the United States as having this kind of technological lead, and they view access to AI systems as a kind of key part of their economic plans. And so they really are making some effort to move away from China. At the same time, they're still conducting military exercises with the Chinese. They have not divested G42 divested from certain Chinese tech investments, but those investments were then kind of put into a different part of the Emirati state, also chaired by the National Security Advisor. The Chinese and the Emiratis still speak of their relationship as being extremely robust. You have not seen kind of massive public blowback from the Chinese against the UAE in a way that you might have seen when other countries distance themselves from Chinese tech. When Sweden distanced itself from Huawei several years ago, that caused a major...
Right, thinking of the 5G discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you've not seen that happening publicly between China and the UAE. So my read of the UAE case in particular would be that they have made real moves towards the US, but it's not irreversible. That they've not broken off. They have an extremely robust economic relationship more broadly. They have fairly close political and security relationships as well, and they could change their mind. Take more broadly this question of whether it's realistic to expect countries. I think in the United States view, if you want access to advanced US AI chips, if this technology really is going to be as kind of profoundly, have these kind of profound national security consequences, in the Biden administration's view, it is realistic not to expect a kind of complete decoupling in every domain, but when it comes to cracking down on chip smuggling, when it comes to having good cybersecurity provisions in your data centers, when it comes to doing personnel vetting, when it comes to a bunch of these issues related specifically to kind of AI, the AI domain, in their view, it is realistic. In their view, this is just, the stakes are so high because of the potential importance of this technology that it's just worth taking these kind of admittedly quite extreme measures.
Okay, well, but then if even a state that at such a high level chose sides, if you will, if even there we're not completely sure how deep the severing of ties went, then isn't the incentive of a three-tier system for those countries who have not been designated key partners and allies by the US to instead look elsewhere? And if, the US currently has the lead on some of these chips and China can't yet provide them, isn't it worth it for these countries to just wait that out, since, as you've told us in the beginning, the speed and pace of development and technology is so quick here that we can expect China to catch up?
Yeah, so this is the heart of a lot of the industry's objections to this. When they talk about this rule being renamed the framework for the advancement of Huawei, this is the kind of core of their argument, that we're just going to drive a lot of countries in tier 2. These countries want chips. They don't want to be told what they have to do with those chips to get access to them. Won't they look elsewhere, in particular to China, which is really the only other kind of major player when it comes to this kind of tech stack. I think in some respects that argument does not hold much weight right now, because China is doing extremely well when it comes to developing models. They have very sophisticated, frontier models that maybe are only kind of a couple months behind the US's. But when it comes to chip production at scale, the ability to kind of build, and export millions of advanced AI chips in particular, these kind of technological marvels that come out of companies like TSMC in Taiwan that are designed by NVIDIA in the United States, there China is much more constrained. So right now, one of the reasons the United States introduced this rule is because China is smuggling a lot of US chips into China to get around export controls. But the reason they're having to resort to so much smuggling of US chips is because they can't produce these chips themselves at enough scale to meet their own needs. And that's in part because of the US export control restrictions that originally the Trump administration, then the Biden administration applied on access to the kind of key manufacturing equipment that you need to build these semiconductors. So these kind of really advanced machines that come out of places like the Netherlands, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, these kind of key semiconductor partners. And China does not have access to the kind of cutting edge technology that's needed there. And so right now, and probably for the next kind of couple of years, probably at least, China is so constrained on its domestic use of chips, it needs millions of chips for its own use, that it's unlikely to be exporting them overseas, because it just, especially if China views this as such a key national security issue in the same way the United States does, it's going to really want to put every one of its chips that it can get access to its own uses before it exports them. So at least in the chip export side of this, part of this equation, right now, if you don't want access to US AI chips, if you're not prepared to accept these strings, there is no alternative. China is not producing chips at scale right now. But the point you're making about maybe you just wait a few years, like that could well be, that is potentially an answer. I think for some of these countries, certainly if you're the UAE, if you're maybe Poland, you're trying to embarking on a big military modernization program right now, or if you're, Israel, a country really reliant on access to high-tech systems, for those countries, just waiting a few years for the chips that are going to, underpin really everything in an advanced economy, both the national security side, but also just healthcare, like a whole bunch of activities, just waiting a few years until maybe China is willing to export things. Maybe the Chinese will apply strings that we don't know. Like that might be a bit of a gamble. So I think right now the US has a lot of leverage. I do think that there certainly are costs to using that leverage so bluntly. Like maybe it certainly is, it is alienating countries. The US will pay diplomatic costs for this, and those countries may try to look elsewhere. But for now, at least when it comes to access to these kind of cutting edge chips that you need, there is no real alternative.
I guess where I have questions is the rigidity of the tiers, if you will. So my understanding is that in this broad race for tech dominance and competition with China, one playing field are the emerging economies, are the countries of the global south that haven't chosen sides yet, that haven't in the past been at an economic development level where this was really relevant, but that might arrive there in the future. And my understanding is right now those countries are not in tier one
right.
of this new AI rule, but as they become economically stronger, more relevant players, wouldn't it make sense for the US to give them a path out of this in order to try and cement relationships with these countries where the US currently does not have a strong history of cooperation and might cede the field to China otherwise?
For sure. So it's absolutely true that the way the Biden administration designed this approach, there is no way to move between tiers. There's no way for a tier 2 country to become a tier 1 country. But within each tier, so within tier 2, there are ways in which you can get access to more chips by basically adopting a set of US governance standards, working with US tech companies, or having your local tech companies adopt a whole bunch of kind of rules that kind of bring them into a kind of, it's basically a way of exporting US tech standards. So part of the way the Biden administration designed this was to try and provide an incentive to countries in the global south, these emerging economies that you're talking about, to try and kind of adopt US standards to get access to US chips. But I think you're completely right. There's this whole other area of tech competition that puts aside the advanced AI chips, but it's just about access to models or more basic digital infrastructure, where the US doesn't really have there is a risk that the US does not have a kind of compelling offer to a lot of these countries in the global south. And there, maybe it's the case that for these cutting edge chips that you need to train the biggest models, maybe those remain all in the US, but China exports kind of good enough models. It doesn't necessarily build the kind of massive data centers for training them overseas, but a lot of countries around the world maybe just start using Chinese model. There's a whole other array of arenas for tech competition and competition related to AI that this rule does not really touch upon, that involve promoting US technology in a lot of these emerging economies. And I think that is that's going to be a key challenge for the next administration, is trying to figure out how do you promote US technology, how do you unlock funds to do so, how do you work with these countries, even if you're trying to control the frontier of the technology, how do you kind of compete on this whole other array of digital infrastructure projects where frankly, China has been outcompeting the United States in lots of places around the world, and I don't think. I think the Trump administration is eager, and especially the tech elements of the Trump administration are eager to get U.S. technology out there and into these markets. But this kind of goes back to this AI export dilemma. Like they have to do that while navigating the fact that they also want to kind of keep control of the kind of frontier, the cutting edge stuff within the U.S. for national security reasons.
Okay, so that leads us really nicely into what I really want to make sure we talk about, which is how might the U.S. approach to everything that we've just discussed changed under the Trump administration? I think it might make sense to stay in the three camps and where you see them. How will they navigate the dilemmas that are attached to exporting AI and restricting the exports of AI?
Sure. So the underlying issues will not change at all with the Trump administration. We have on the table now how the Biden administration answered this question, their diffusion framework. The survival of that diffusion framework under the Trump administration is very much up for grabs. Maybe by the time this episode is released, we'll have an answer there. But even putting that aside, each of the three camps that I talk about, this kind of strategy of control, the strategy of diffusion, which is confusingly linked
distribution.
To distribution, exactly. Exactly. Proliferation is another option that's a little bit negatively framed. But broadly, these three camps, the camp that wants to control things, the camp that wants to, in Oracle, one tech company's words, flood the zone, just get US technology out there into all these markets, and this other camp that seeks to kind of bargain, use US chip exports as leverage. All of those three camps are represented in the Trump administration. Industry, NVIDIA, Oracle, these tech companies are lobbying intensely. They may have a big voice. We don't know exactly how much influence they'll have around Trump, but they want to get out there and flood the zone. they will certainly get a hearing. The national security hawks who want to lock everything down, control it, very worried about, really want to tighten export controls on China, very worried about the Biden administration kind of leaving a lot of loopholes in its export controls, and they really want to kind of tighten that. Potentially people like Marco Rubio at State, the new Secretary of State, certainly folks in the National Security Council, long-term China hawks, they are going to be very sympathetic to this kind of strategy of control that seeks to lock everything down. And then this kind of leverage-focused approach is really quite in keeping with Trump's own instincts. He loves using access to U.S. Access to U.S. economic resources as a bargaining chip to negotiate over anything. Like not just like he could link this to all sorts of other issues in exchange for concessions. So if again to go back to the Saudi example, if it helps him land a peace deal to just throw in access to lots of U.S. chips, maybe he'll do that. So all three of these camps are represented. And I don't know, I think this is the key thing to watch is going to be which of these camps has more influence in these kind of internal fights that are likely to play out. One big kind of unknown here is where Elon Musk lands.
Right.
Because that's very unclear where within this kind of schema he would land.
Yeah, especially given you've told us that industry is divided and we see some of the hyperscalers and the great cloud companies maybe being less critical because they know that they can navigate this well. Zuckerberg might be less critical, for instance, standing right behind Trump at inauguration. We can probably expect him to have some influence. But Elon Musk, you think, is still up for grabs?
Yeah, I don't know. So one motivation for kind of controlling a lot of these data centers within the US and close allies is that you can potentially apply stricter kind of governance, cybersecurity standards if you're worried about the risks of advanced AI systems. And Elon in the past has certainly expressed a lot of concern about the risks of highly capable systems. So he also might not want to, he might support some of these measures, some of these conditions. At the same time, he wants access to markets. I don't have a great grasp of how Elon Musk would think about this, but at the core of the Biden administration's answer to this was basically trying to encourage the rest of the world to work with U.S. tech companies and to build their data centers in the United States. One provision that I forgot to mention in the rule was U.S. tech companies are allowed to build data centers anywhere they want, as long as at least 50% of their total kind of computing power is kept within the United States, and no more than 7% of their total computing power is built in any one country. So it's basically an attempt to prevent these companies from offshoring their advanced technology. That's quite in keeping with some of J.D. Vance's instincts when it comes to industrial policy. Why are we building these data centers overseas? Why aren't we building them within the United States? And especially if the Trump administration goes ahead with a lot of its deregulation of energy, its permitting reforms to make it easier. A lot of that is focused. There's a lot of continuity between what they were doing in this front and what the Biden administration was doing in its kind of final weeks on this front as well. But a lot of this is designed to make it easier to build domestically, to try and potentially lower the incentives that these tech companies face to build these data centers overseas. So my sense is that there is a lot in the Biden administration's answer, the Biden administration's kind of rule, this interim final rule they released. There are a lot of elements of that will be quite appealing to the Trump administration when they actually dig into it. At the same time, parts of industry will hate it. They'll still continue to lobby against it. And it is a very it's a very complicated rule, and it's very, everything is written down very explicitly. It's very intricately designed. That's not exactly the style of the Trump administration. They
heavy hand of government.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is and it is it's a very engineered piece of rulemaking. So, there's lots of possibilities. They could totally scrap the framework, or they could scrap it and then bring something that looks a lot like it back in a few months, or they could keep it. They can certainly, they can play around with the exact numbers in it in terms of the number of chips they have. They can make it easier for countries like the Gulf states, who Trump has historically had very close relationships with. They can make it easier for them to get chips. A lot of that is possible to do while keeping the basic framework. It's sort of, in some sense, it kind of undermines, if you can just connect access to chips with anything you want, or move countries around kind of arbitrarily, in some sense it undermines the point of the framework, which is to kind of make it more explicit and clear. But this broad approach of trading access to US chips in exchange for tougher lines on China, in exchange for concessions in some other domain, in exchange for cybersecurity provisions in data centers, I think a lot of that will be quite appealing to members of the incoming Trump team.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think you've done a great job at just giving us an idea of what to look out for as we enter and head into the first weeks and months of this administration in terms of where they will land. I want to, I guess, towards the end of this conversation, zoom out again a little bit, because you started out by telling us about the recent huge progress that has been made, the expectation that within a few years' time, we could really land somewhere, a brave new world of AI, right? And then we've talked about choosing camps, we've talked about great power competition in the space of AI. I want to just give you a chance to give us a sense of what a world of great power competition over AI dominance really looks like. How will that play out? What does a Chinese AI, how does that compare to a US AI, and how will that be felt by citizens all over the world?
So I think this is the big question that is kind of under, in some sense, there's a lot of hype and talk around this, but really kind of carefully laying out what a world looks like in which you have highly capable technological systems in the hands of one, probably rapidly soon after, two major powers. What that looks like for the rest of the world, I think, is very unclear. So if we do see, and there are big ifs around all this, like forecasting a lot of these rates of technological progress is very difficult to do. But if a lot of these AI labs are right, and that we do see kind of highly capable systems emerging in the next kind of 1 to 2 years in the United States, 2 to 3, even 4 years, that unlock significantly higher levels of economic growth, military innovation, R&D, cyber capabilities, you name it. That's a huge advantage for states on the international stage. At the same time, at least so far, China is not that far behind. It's likely that even if the US develops highly capable systems in the next couple of years, China will be there or thereabouts soon afterwards, unless things escalate in other ways. And so what a world looks like in which these two major powers have highly capable systems that put them far ahead of a lot of other states, potentially, I don't think we have a great, I don't think there's been enough research or enough kind of careful thought about what this kind of strategic equilibrium looks like, and what the play for other countries like India or like the Europeans, or all these other kind of middle, swing states, emerging economies, how they respond to that. I think countries like the UAE clearly see an opportunity for them to kind of play a major role in this, in this emerging race. They have the resources when it comes to energy, when it comes to capital, to kind of build their wealth, their power, and to have influence in this kind of technological competition. But I think a lot of other states have not yet figured out like how they fit into, what the geopolitics of this look like, and how they should respond to this. Do they join the camp of whichever country develops the most powerful systems first? Do they try to hedge against that in some ways by building alliances with other less powerful states? Like all these kind of questions around geopolitics in the shadow of highly capable new technological systems, we don't have great analogies for. Nuclear weapons is one obvious example, but a very different sort of technology to these private sector-led AI systems that are going to be that are diffusing more rapidly, that are going to be where it's much harder to kind of control who has access to those technologies, although the US government is trying to do so. So I don't know what this kind of emerging age of AI diplomacy looks like. A lot of this depends on the continued rate of technological progress. It could be that we hit another plateau in the next kind of year or two. It could be that the hype is overrated, but it could also be that we really are living through a kind of potentially historic period where we see kind of step changes in the technological capability of some states on the international stage, but not others. And how they then navigate it, and how we make sure that we try to distribute the benefits that come with those advanced systems to as many people around the world as possible. I think that's going to be a kind of core challenge for the next administration if the rate of technological change continues as rapidly as it has for the past couple of years.
I mean, when it comes to aligning with one camp over the other, is this just about, as you just put it, who has the most powerful systems? Or is this also a question of norms and standards and values, really, and AI safety and how these systems get operated?
Yeah, it's all of those things. So one concern that some US policymakers have, and I think particularly folks potentially coming into the Trump administration have, is that maybe the US continues to lead with these frontier AI systems, the kind of most exquisite, the most powerful systems. But most of the world then uses Chinese models that are not quite as good, but they're good enough and they're cheaper. And those models, AI systems are very closely linked with information process, with norms around politics and information. These are very political technologies in a certain sense. And so if the whole world is using technologies that are trained in China, that are designed in China, those may promote very different norms and values and views of politics to US models. They may give very different answers if you ask them questions about Tiananmen Square or Taiwan or any number of potential issues. And so one concern that you could have when it comes to kind of the promotion of these norms and standards is that whichever country wins not just the race for the kind of most exquisite systems, but the broader distribution and dissemination of these systems worldwide will have the opportunity to set a lot of the kind of terms of political and philosophical debate in vast swathes of the world potentially. And so I think that does relate to the kind of question around AI governance and standards. On the kind of the last thing I would say is that we still don't really know how to control the behavior of highly capable systems that may be more intelligent than humans. And there is an area of alignment between the United States and China, I think, because neither one of these states wants to lose control of a very powerful system. And so there may still be some areas for cooperation, or at least, I don't think explicit cooperation right now, but at least lines of communication or work that takes place in parallel on these questions around these kind of potentially less political questions around just how do we make sure that systems that are potentially more intelligent than any human, across the board than humans, and are kind of rapidly scalable and can make decisions very quickly, how do we make sure that that we don't lose control of those systems and cause potentially major accidents? And there, I think there's potentially more room for kind of more international dialogue, collaboration on setting some norms and standards. But I think that's a very limited area of cooperation right now, given just the kind of the stakes, the arms race dynamics that we're seeing, and the just kind of broader geopolitical backdrop where there's relatively limited arenas right now for kind of intimate US-Chinese high-level engagement.
So, full transparency, we're back. We're recording this bit of the podcast about a week later. Those of you who watch us on YouTube will see that we're wearing different outfits, so there was never any point in pretending otherwise. And it sort of serves us right for trying to record a podcast about AI with a week-long lag before the release, because a lot has happened since we last spoke, Sam. The thing that we really wanted to make sure we talk about before this episode goes out is, of course, the release of DeepSeek, of the new Chinese AI model, and the reactions to it. I mean, the stock market crashes that we've seen, the outrage from US companies, and the general sense that if the Chinese can do this with far fewer of these advanced chips that we thought they needed, then is this whole AI diffusion rule that we've been discussing, the whole approach of the Americans to try and restrict experts, is that all for naught, Sam? Is it?
So that is a big question. So just to give some context here, DeepSeek is a kind of Chinese startup, slightly odd company. It's kind of a spin-off of a Chinese hedge fund. And in the last couple of weeks, they released this new model called DeepSeek, called the R1 model, which has gained an enormous amount of attention. And the main reason for that is that it's achieved very impressive results on various kind of standardized benchmarks, but at a fraction of the cost that US companies have generally been achieving for similar models. So a ballpark figure that's been going around is about that they trained their final model for under $6 million, compared to probably an order of magnitude more for the frontier US models, and using only about 2,000 chips. Meta's latest model used probably about 16,000 chips. So a very efficient model, very impressive result to achieve when you have such kind of constraints in terms of your access to computing power. I think some of that is a little bit overhyped. The 6 million figure is probably just the marginal cost of training the final run. It doesn't include, you can't just do this if you have $6 million. This is, if you are already a sophisticated company with a huge research team and big data centers, then the final run maybe you can do for $6 million.
But still, it was enough to make people here panic.
For sure, yeah. And I think it's kind of raised a couple of big questions. One is, does this render the kind of U.S. export control strategy, this whole U.S. approach that the Trump administration started and the Biden administration really drove forward of trying to kind of restrict China's access to chips, and the diffusion framework that we talked about was kind of one element of this, trying to crack down on Chinese chip smuggling. Does this render this whole strategy ineffective at best, or potentially even like totally counterproductive at worst. Because one narrative that is starting to gain some steam is this idea that by incentivizing Chinese companies to be even more efficient, to come up with these kind of smarter ways of using their chips, it really kind of drove them forward in a way that they might not have otherwise been incentivized to do. And then, of course, it's also raised huge implications for the stock market. And the major driver here is that if it's the case that you don't need as many chips to unlock these kind of these impressive gains in intelligence and capabilities of these models, then that's not great news for NVIDIA's future prospects, which are relying on selling vast quantities of chips to everyone who wants them. And it's also not great news for these kind of big capital expenditures that US tech companies have been making. So I think we may have spoken briefly about this last time, but the $500 billion investments that President Trump announced with Sam Altman from OpenAI, the Stargate project, maybe all of these investments are kind of, we're just overbuilding too much capacity, and a lot of this stuff may not actually, these companies may not be able to generate the revenues to justify those sorts of investments if it's the case that you can achieve much similar results for on the cheap. So that's the kind of context for this. I think some of those narratives are a little bit oversimplified, but that's kind of the backdrop of these kind of very dramatic moves we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks in the markets and in the kind of debates over export controls.
Okay, well then be the voice of reason for us. Why do you think this is overblown? Why do you think maybe the reaction, the stock market, and also perhaps the policy reaction is going to find a balance after this?
Yeah, so I don't think this is certainly an extremely impressive breakthrough by the Chinese, by this Chinese company. I think it certainly shows that the US lead when it comes to model development, not when it comes to chip production, which is a lot of what we were talking about in the context of the fusion framework, not when it comes to the actual manufacturing of chips. This doesn't have big implications for that. But certainly when it comes to the models, the software, this shows that the Chinese are pretty close behind the US, if not at the front, it's slightly hard to assess because one interesting thing about what DeepSeek did is that they published their results openly, which is a practice that almost all of the major US tech companies have stopped doing. So we don't know exactly where OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, we don't know exactly what sorts of innovations they're working on. In the next month or two, OpenAI is going to release their latest model, which is even more impressive than past results. So it's not the case that Chinese companies are now ahead of the US when it comes to these frontier models. But it is the case that they've closed the gap clearly on software. And so it's certainly a big deal. I think the implications for the export control debates are not as clear-cut. So it is the case that using fewer chips, the Chinese have been able to unlock a greater level of intelligence per chip, essentially. But it's still always helpful to have more chips. Like the fact that you can get more intelligence out of a smaller number of chips presumably means that the more chips you have, you can unlock even more impressive capabilities. And that's because we're at the beginning of this sort of new paradigm that that tech experts talk about, and that's with these new types of models that are kind of they're called reasoning models, where they start to reason through a kind of chain of thought as they think about an answer. And that's kind of that paradigm of models only started in the last couple of months. And within that paradigm, it's still really helpful to have more chips to train your models in a bigger and bigger way. So one way to think about this is potentially that within this new paradigm, OpenAI's models within this paradigm and DeepSeek's models within this new way of training models are kind of like GPT-2. So a model that was kind of impressive, but once you scaled it up with more and more chips, more and more computing power, you could unlock even better models, GPT-3, GPT-4. And we're going to see something similar in this new style of model. So that's a slightly long-winded way of saying that chips still really matter. Having access to computing power really matters. And that was the kind of underlying insight or the underlying rationale behind the export controls, behind the attempt to control computing power in the diffusion framework. So in some sense, this makes controlling chips even more important than it was before. So you may see kind of renewed efforts to crack down on chip smuggling, to tighten the loopholes, to restrict Chinese access to these chips now that they've kind of demonstrated their prowess here.
Sam, this has been so interesting. I could keep asking you questions. I'm really glad that we opened it up towards the end there, because I think we got into some really important questions underpinning this whole conversation. But we did get to the end of this episode. I'm sure we'll have you back. And at this point of the show, I do like to ask our guests what book, what paper they want to recommend to our listeners to better understand the issue.
Sure. I think one paper to read that gives you a sense of the stakes in this race and the kind of hype that is currently circulating in Silicon Valley and also parts of the kind of technological national security establishment in DC, is this long memo that I mentioned by this former OpenAI researcher, Leopold Aschenbrenner, called Situational Awareness. And this is this kind of long, sort of 50,000-word essay he posted in a series of PDFs online. It's filled with speculation. It has lots of assumptions that many researchers in the field disagree with, but it gives you some sense of the narratives that are going around a lot of these kind of frontier AI labs and the kind of geopolitical consequences. So there's a lot of parallels that he draws between the race to frontier AI systems and the race to nuclear weapons in World War II. A lot of emphasis on the kind of real historical stakes of developing these kind of cutting-edge new technologies. And he places a big emphasis on the speed at which change could happen. Again, it's a very provocative essay. There's lots to disagree with in it, but I think it's hard to understate how much impact that essay and thinking like that has had, certainly in Silicon Valley, but also increasingly, I think, in parts of the kind of national security community in DC who are kind of following these issues. I think that essay really had quite a big impact in terms of triggering a lot of these questions around controlling these systems, winning this race. Even Ivanka Trump even tweeted out a link to this paper to give you some sense of the impact it had. For a very different take on trajectories of technological change and how they interact with geopolitics, I would recommend this book by a professor at George Washington called Jeffrey Ding. The book is called Technology and the Rise of Great Powers, and it's a much more careful kind of academic treatise than the Aschenbrenner memo, but he goes back and looks at various waves of technological innovation in the past, like during the Industrial Revolution, various other historical junctures, and kind of traces how these technologies diffused and what really mattered for geopolitical competition and the influence of states. And in his view, what really matters is not which state has the kind of cutting edge innovation first. It didn't really matter who invented the key innovations when it came to the textile industry, let's say, in the 19th century, or electricity. What mattered more was how quickly states could diffuse those technologies within their domestic economies and really roll them out at scale. And that is a much more gradual process. And so in his view, this analogy to nuclear weapons that someone like Aschenbrenner draws is pretty misleading. AI is more like electricity than it is like a nuclear weapon, in the sense that once one state gets electricity, it wasn't really this kind of binary, you have it or you don't have it moment. It was this kind of more gradual process of technological diffusion. And if that view is right, that leads you to pretty different kind of policy implications than the Aschenbrenner view of like, we're in a 1 or 2 year decisive race to get there first. And that's the kind of key thing that matters.
That's really interesting. It's also a third meaning of diffusion, right?
Yeah,
now we're talking about it in the domestic context.
Exactly. So really confusing that. Everyone is using this. That is a huge issue at this field. So yeah, Jeffrey Ding is using diffusion to mean how quickly can you take cutting edge innovations and roll them out at scale within your domestic economy. And it's not enough just to have, the best AI system sitting in a lab in California if it's not being used by the government more broadly, by tech companies more broadly, and that requires, an educated workforce. It requires this much broader range of reforms to unlock a country's full potential. The third book I'd recommend, which is somewhat related but in a totally different topic, is this great book called When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut, which is this series of sort of essays about scientific discovery and their connection to kind of madness and these kind of scientific breakthroughs that led researchers to kind of go a little bit crazy. And it's this interesting mixture, unlike any book I've read, of being kind of fiction and nonfiction. And the book starts out mostly nonfiction, like mostly entirely historically accurate, and then becomes gradually more kind of imaginative and fictional as it goes through. But it's just a kind of beautifully written sort of meditation on the connection between kind of profound scientific discoveries and mental breakdown. So I would put it, which is cheery reading for a current moment.
No, you're like the third person to recommend this book to me, so I shall pick it up. Sam, thank you so much. This was brilliant.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Thanks to the excellent Hyewon Park, who is our audio engineer and executive producer, and to Cameron Zotter, who is our videographer. I'm Sophia Besch, Senior Fellow in the Euro Program and host of The World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.